At the end of part 1 I promised to produce more evidence that not everything is as it seems, and in the spiritual or religious world virtually everything hides something else. I argued that evolution is hiding God, as the definition of one is very similar to the possible definition of the other. This is a big step for many to take, so I need to show how the Genesis creation is very similar to evolution in that it too hides something else and imposes a selection process in the human world, very similar to natural selection in the natural world. Before I introduce you to the metaphors of talking snakes, trees of knowledge and people living nearly 1,000 years, let me say that the first few chapters of Genesis are complicated and there is no way that I can explain everything in a 10-minute video. The Genesis story is very similar to the city of Jericho with its high walls, massive gates and residents armed to the teeth. It's a city which cannot be taken, and even after a lifetime of study there are still parts which I cannot explain. So we'll start with the selection process, as this is fairly easy. Most people in the 21st century now reject the creation story either as a literal concept or as an allegory for something else. This has all the appearances of being the best solution, as we now have the scientific knowledge and evidence that things were very different millions of years ago. To put it bluntly, the world wasn't made in 6 days, and these 6 days did not occur 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. These are two massive pieces of scientific evidence and sufficient for most people to reject the Genesis creation. As a creation story is the basis of the Bible, and therefore the belief system of at least two major world religions, Judaism and Christianity, these people have rejected the Bible and religion as well. The deselection process has begun, and as you'll see later, this is a spiritual equivalent of natural selection in the natural world. Then at the other end of the spectrum there are those people who take everything literally and believe everything that the Genesis creation says, as they work on the assumption that Jesus must have believed it, so they should too. Well, firstly, we have no evidence that Jesus believed the Genesis story as literally happening, and secondly, these people have deselected themselves from reality and rationality, and probably from society as well, as nobody wants to associate with what is nowadays called a fundamentalist or a creationist. If you take the Genesis creation literally, then it means that you have to take the rest of the Bible scripture literally as well, which brings you into conflict with all sorts of problems such as slavery, misogyny, racialism, violence, a supernatural being of evil, 10-headed dragons, talking donkeys, unicorns, and so on. This selection process is difficult to see at the moment because it will be a new concept to most people. But there is no doubt in my mind that the Bible has been made difficult to read and understand for this reason alone. Jesus made this fairly clear when he said this. The disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Why do you speak to the people in parables?" He replied, "Because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. This is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand." So what is the Genesis creation hiding? Or put another way, what are all the people who reject Genesis really missing out on? Well, they're missing 1,001 things, but if I had to narrow it down to just one, I would choose prophecy. Here is a dictionary definition to put this in context. But this definition is less than half the story. We need to establish whether prophecy is humanly possible or not. Given that we are bound by space, time and 3 dimensions, it is fairly well agreed that humans cannot predict the future and get it right. There are plenty of predictions going around in the worlds of finance and politics, as leaders of countries have to plan ahead. But saying that the financial index will fall about 0.2% isn't quite the same as saying, on Friday at 10 AM GMT, the index will be 6.234. One is vague, and the other is quite specific. In a biblical context, a prophecy with vague implications would say something on the lines of, In the future, things are not going to get better. A prophecy which is very specific and therefore not possible from a human point of view would say something like, before the end of the world, Jerusalem will be surrounded by armies from many different lands, and you'll need to get out fast. This is what we read in Luke chapter 21. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. Or instead of, at the end of the world times will be hard, we have this in great detail. The second beast also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. In other words, the Bible is quite specific. It is therefore unique in all the world's literature in that its prophecies are detailed, and at least 50% of these prophecies have already happened. From a personal point of view, I can say quite frankly that I would have abandoned religion, the Bible and everything else associated with them many years ago, but for the prophecies. The mantra that I keep repeating in all my videos is that the Bible is full of exaggerations, contradictions, violence, misogyny, racialism and outdated and violent laws, but hid amongst all this detritus are the prophecies, and these prophecies cannot have been humanly devised. They are too specific, too accurate, and too many of them have already happened. So if we return to Genesis, what does it hide? And where are the prophecies? Well, some are obvious and others are not. So let's start with one of the less obvious ones. In the first chapter, we have the 6-day creation, and on the first day, we have the creation of light. But there's a problem. How can there be any light when the sun, stars and planets haven't yet been made? In verse 17 we have this, which is 3 days later. But the problem here is that we're looking at things from a 21st century point of view, and as a result we're missing the metaphor of light and what it means in a spiritual sense. Of course, there's the interpretation that Jesus is the light of the world, and that he has always been present in the past, present and future. This all sounds very far-fetched, but it's all there in John chapter 1. Then there's a reference to the light of Yahweh in Revelation, where there'll be no need of the sun. So when light was created on the first day, it probably had nothing to do with the sun or the stars, but was a metaphor for the beginning of consciousness, where good and evil were represented by light and darkness, and would be at war with each other from that time onwards. Consciousness is a difficult subject, but in the evolution of humans it too must have evolved. There had to come a time when humans had developed to such a stage that they could no longer run around semi-naked, killing everything that moved, including themselves. The first few chapters of Genesis was that time, and is shown quite clearly to be similar, when the metaphorical first sibling on earth ended up killing his brother. Now let's move on to a prophecy which is more obvious. Well, actually it's more a statement of fact as opposed to telling the future, but is still quite remarkable. In Genesis chapter 2 we have a description of the Garden of Eden, where the names of 4 rivers and 3 countries appear. These verses are both strange and illuminating. Strange because they are written like a geography lesson in the middle of a history lesson. Here we have a story which includes the first man, Adam, being made from dust, the first woman being made from a piece of bone, a tree with knowledge of good and evil, Adam naming all the creatures that were brought to him even though he had just been made himself and wouldn't have had the slightest idea about genus or species. And illuminating because these verses seem to shout at us that maybe this isn't a metaphor after all, and we had better start doing some serious study as to whether these rivers and place names are in fact actual places? Well, we don't have to study for long because the Tigris and Euphrates rivers are immediately identifiable. Here is a map where you can see that the Euphrates runs from southeastern Turkey through Syria and Iraq and joins the sea at the Persian Gulf. The river Tigris takes the same route. It joins the Euphrates a few miles from the Persian Gulf. Apart from dams and canals made from the waters of these rivers, we can assume that they have been there for at least 50,000 years. So what else has happened during these 50,000 years? An event called the migration of early humans. Historical migration of human populations begins with the movement of Homo erectus out of Africa across Eurasia about 1.75 million years ago. Humans appear to have occupied all of Africa about 150,000 years ago, moved out of Africa 70,000 years ago, and had spread across Australia and so on. Now here's a map showing that migration. If you look carefully at the first arrow on this map, you will notice that the early migration of humans was from Africa to the Middle East. You should also know from your school days that the most ancient civilizations on Earth are found in Iraq, Syria and Turkey, the same area as the 4 rivers and 3 countries listed in Genesis 2. Is it just coincidence, or does it show there's an alarming but basic truth in the Genesis story? Why is something that has only been discovered in the last 20 years with the discovery of DNA confirm a story which is over 2,000 years old? And one final question. Why did the Genesis writer name these rivers and countries in the first place? I ask that because if you examine the text closely in Genesis 2, these verses, that is 10 to 14, don't even need to be there. So, amongst all the metaphors of talking snakes, trees with knowledge, and boats full of animals, Genesis does hide many eternal truths and prophecies. And if we reject it all, we've missed out on something really important. In part 3, I will show further evidence of how the Bible hides its main message behind unbelievable stories, and at the same time applies a selection process to those that read it.